I work nights at a hospital, not as a doctor or a nurse. I'm a patient care technician, which is a fancy way of saying I help with the things nurses don't always have time to do. I take vitals, help patients get to the bathroom, change bedding, answer call lights, and occasionally sit with people who shouldn't be left alone. I've been doing it for almost 6 years now. The first few years were difficult. I had to get used to the smell of antiseptic, the constant alarms, the fluorescent lights that never seemed to turn off, and the fact that people could be laughing in one room while someone was taking their final breath just a few doors down. You get used to a lot of things working in a hospital. The sounds, mostly, the beeping monitors, the squeaking wheels of hospital beds, the intercom announcements, the footsteps in the hallways, and eventually the silence. That's the one people don't tell you about. Hospitals are never completely quiet. There's always something running somewhere. A machine, an air vent, a distant alarm. But certain parts of a hospital can become so quiet at night that you start noticing things you probably shouldn't. The building I worked in was an older hospital on the outskirts of town. It had been expanded several times over the years, so the layout was a mess. Some hallways were modern and brightly lit, while others looked like they had been built decades earlier. The basement was the worst. That was where the morgue was. I didn't work down there often, but my job occasionally required me to transport patients after they had passed away. I know that sounds uncomfortable. It was. But death was part of the job. You learn not to think about the person as a body. You thought about them as a patient, someone's father, someone's wife, someone's son. You treated them with respect, covered them properly, and took them where they needed to go. That was it. At least that was what I believed before the night I met Mr. Harlan. Mr. Harlan had been in the hospital for almost 3 weeks. He was an older man, probably in his late 70s. He had been admitted after suffering complications from a serious illness. I didn't know the exact medical details, and honestly, I didn't ask. He was one of those patients who rarely had visitors. I remember seeing him sitting near the window in his room during the day, staring outside, even when there was nothing to look at. His room was on the 4th floor, at the end of a hallway. Room 417. I remember that number because I ended up seeing it a lot. Mr. Harlan was quiet, not rude, not difficult, just quiet. Whenever I checked on him, he would usually be awake, staring at the ceiling. Sometimes I would ask if he needed anything. He would say no. Sometimes he would ask me what time it was. I always thought that was strange, because there was a clock on the wall directly across from his bed. But I answered him anyway. 2:20. 2:20 what? 2:20 in the morning, he would nod. Then he would go back to staring at the ceiling. The first time I really noticed something unusual about him was during a night shift in October. It was around 2:20 a.m. I was making my rounds when I passed room 417. The door was slightly open. I glanced inside. Mr. Harlan was sitting upright in bed. I stopped. Mr. Harlan? He turned his head toward me. Do you know what time it is? I looked at the clock. 2:20. He stared at me for a moment. Then he said something that I didn't understand. I stepped closer. What was that? He looked toward the hallway. Is the door locked? I looked at the door. No. Lock it. I smiled awkwardly. I can't lock your room from the outside. He continued staring at me. Then don't let him in. I remember laughing a little because I thought he was confused. Who? Mr. Harlan looked back toward the hallway. The expression on his face changed. It wasn't fear exactly. It was recognition. like he was looking at someone he had been expecting. Then he whispered, "He knows I'm here." I looked behind me. There was nobody in the hallway. I checked the room. There was no one in the bathroom. No one behind the curtain. No one anywhere. When I turned back, Mr. Harlan was lying down again. I asked him if he needed anything. He didn't answer. I left the room. I didn't think much of it after that. Patients said strange things all the time, especially patients who were sick, medicated, exhausted, or confused. I had heard much stranger things. A few hours later, around 5 a.m., I was helping another patient when I heard a call light go off. Room 417. I remember looking at the screen. Then I remember thinking, that's weird. Mr. Harlan's call light had been going off constantly for the past few days, but he had never once pressed it himself. Usually, he would just stare at the button when I asked him about it. I walked toward his room. The hallway was empty. The lights were dimmed for the night. I reached room 417. The door was open. I knocked on the frame. "Mr. Harlan?" No answer. I stepped inside. He was asleep, or at least I thought he was asleep. I checked the call light. It was still active. I pressed the reset button. The light went off. Then Mr. Harlan opened his eyes. "Who pressed it?" I looked at him. "You did." He shook his head. "No." I smiled. "You probably forgot." I didn't press it. There was something about the way he said it that made me stop smiling. He was completely serious. I looked at the call light, then back at him. "Okay." He stared at the ceiling. Then he said, "He does that." I didn't ask who he meant. I probably should have. Instead, I told him to get some rest and left. The next time I saw him was 2 nights later. It was a little after midnight. I was at the nurse's station when one of the nurses walked over. "Can you check on 417? I looked up. "Mr. Harlan?" She nodded. "He hasn't answered his call light." I frowned. "He has one on?" "No, that's the problem." I didn't understand. She lowered her voice. "His monitor is acting strange." I followed her to the room. Mr. Harlan was lying in bed. The monitor beside him was making a quiet beeping sound. The nurse looked at the screen, then frowned. "That's weird." "What?" She didn't answer. She checked the leads. Then she checked Mr. Harlan. I stood near the doorway. After a moment, she said, "I'm going to call the doctor." I didn't ask what was wrong. I already knew something was. The next hour passed quickly. Doctors came in, more nurses came in, the room filled with people. I stayed outside. Eventually, one of the nurses came out. Her face was completely blank. That was how I knew. Mr. Harlan had died. I had seen death before, but there was something different about this. Maybe it was because I had spoken to him 2 nights earlier. Maybe it was because of what he had said. He knows I'm here. I tried not to think about it. I went back to work. The hospital continued operating around us. Patients needed medication. Beds needed changing. Call lights continued going off. The world didn't stop because one person had died. Around 3 a.m. I was sent to room 417. I was supposed to prepare Mr. Harlan for transport to the morgue. The room was empty. The bed had been lowered. The monitors had been disconnected. A sheet covered him completely. I stood beside the bed for a moment. Then I said quietly, "Sorry, Mr. Harlan." I don't know why I said that. Maybe because I had been the last person to speak to him before things got worse. Maybe because of the strange conversation we had. I pulled the bed out into the hallway. The 4th floor was almost completely empty. I started pushing toward the elevator. Then I heard something behind me. A soft sound, like someone tapping a fingernail against glass. I stopped. The bed stopped moving. I looked behind me. The hallway was empty. I looked down at Mr. Harlan. He was still covered. I continued pushing. This time, the sound came from the bed. I stopped again, my hands tightened around the rail. For a few seconds, I just stood there. Then I pulled the sheet down slightly. Mr. Harlan's face was still. His eyes were closed. I stared at him. Then I slowly pulled the sheet back up. I told myself it had been the bed, a loose piece of equipment, a wheel. Something. I reached the elevator, pressed the button. The doors opened. I pushed the bed inside. Then I pressed the button for the basement. The doors closed. The elevator began moving down, and then it stopped. Between floors, the lights flickered. I sighed. Of course. I pressed the emergency button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. Still nothing. Then I heard the tapping. I slowly looked down. The sound was coming from the bed, from underneath the sheet. I stood completely still. The elevator was silent. The emergency light above me flickered. Then I heard something else, a voice, very quiet, very close. Is the door locked? I couldn't breathe. I knew that voice. It was Mr. Harlan. I took one step backward. The bed was between me and the elevator doors. The voice came again. Is the door locked? I pressed the emergency button again. Nothing. Then the sheet moved, just slightly. I watched it. My entire body had gone cold. The shape beneath the sheet shifted. Not much, just enough for me to know I wasn't imagining it. Then something pressed upward against the fabric, the shape of a hand. I stumbled backward and hit the wall. Stop, I whispered. The hand remained there, then the fingers slowly curled. I started pressing every button on the elevator. The alarm finally began to sound, a loud, shrill noise. The bed shook. The sheet moved again. And then the voice whispered, "He knows I'm here." The elevator door suddenly opened. I ran. I left the bed behind. I ran through the basement hallway without looking back. I didn't care about procedure. I didn't care about anything. I reached the morgue doors and nearly collided with the attendant coming out. He grabbed my shoulders. What happened? I couldn't speak. I just pointed behind me. He looked toward the elevator, then looked back at me. What did you see? I finally managed to say, "Mr. Harlan." The attendant's face changed, not because he was confused, because he understood. He looked toward the elevator. Then he said, "You need to go upstairs." I stared at him. What? Go upstairs. Why? He didn't answer. I looked past him. The morgue doors were open. Inside, I could see several covered beds, and one of them was empty. I felt my stomach drop. Where is he? The attendant looked at me. Who? Mr. Harlan. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, Mr. Harlan was already brought down. I felt the blood drain from my face. What? He shook his head. You brought down the wrong patient. I didn't understand. I looked back toward the elevator. The bed was still there, covered. The attendant walked toward it. I followed him. He pulled back the sheet. Expected to see Mr. Harlan. But I didn't. The bed was empty. There was nothing underneath the sheet. Nothing. I stood there, completely frozen. Then the elevator doors began to close. The attendant grabbed my arm. Don't. I looked at him. What? He pointed at the elevator. Don't go back in there. I looked at the empty bed, then at the elevator. The doors closed. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then the elevator began moving. Upward. We could hear it. Floor 1, floor 2, floor 3, floor 4. Then it stopped. The doors opened, somewhere above us, and the emergency phone at the morgue began to ring. The attendant looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us moved. The phone rang again and again. Finally, he picked it up. "Hello?" I watched his face. He said nothing. Then his expression slowly changed. He hung up. "What was it?" He looked at me. "Room 417. I felt my chest tighten. "What about it?" He didn't answer. I asked again. "What about room 417? The attendant looked toward the elevator. Then he said, "Someone is asking for you." I never went back to work after that. Shift. I didn't quit properly. I didn't give 2 weeks' notice. I didn't even go back for my things. I simply stopped answering the phone. For a while, I convinced myself that I had imagined most of it. Maybe I had been exhausted. Maybe the elevator had malfunctioned. Maybe I had transported the wrong bed and panicked. Maybe I had hallucinated the voice. I wanted to believe. That I really did. But about a month later, I received a letter from the hospital. It was a standard employment document. Something about my final paycheck. I almost threw it away. Then I noticed the address printed at the top. Room 417. I know that doesn't make sense. Hospitals don't send mail to rooms. I called the hospital. The number had been disconnected. I searched online. The hospital was still there. Still operating. Still using the same address. But there was no room 417 anymore. The 4th floor had been renovated. The room numbers had changed until I looked at the date on the letter. It had been sent 3 days after. Mr. Harlan died, and at the bottom of the page, beneath the hospital logo, someone had written 3 words. In handwriting, I recognized immediately. Is it locked? I still don't know what happened that night. I don't know who was in that bed. I don't know what the morgue attendant knew, and I don't know why the hospital's records showed that Mr. Harlan had already been transported before I ever took him downstairs. But I do know one thing. I have worked in hospitals for 6 years. I've seen people die. I've seen people wake up confused. I've seen patients hallucinate. I've seen families mistake shadows. For people standing in doorways, there is always an explanation usually, but I still think about that elevator, about the tapping, about the voice coming from underneath the sheet. And sometimes when I'm working late and I hear the sound of a hospital bed being pushed down an empty hallway, I stop, I listen, and I make sure I know exactly who is lying in it before I get too close.